So, Joe, apples, what did you think?
Well, it's got a very arresting setup, a really interesting kind of what if, what if all of a sudden people en masse start to lose their memories? And when I was introduced to this idea, it's a really like provocative idea. And so I started thinking it in terms of its like broader socio-political ramifications. And so I started to think of things like that novel Blindness by Saramago, which has a similar kind of what if people just went blind overnight. And that's a very, very different story, very dark, but it's a much broader canvas. And this it becomes clear pretty quickly with this film that its ambitions are far narrower, that it's not interested in those broader implications, the sort of ethical or philosophical complications arising from this what if at all. Really, it's a very, very narrow story about one man, and that's fine, but it unless that's the story of that one man is very interesting and arresting, then the fact that it doesn't address those broader ideas, it risks it feeling like it kind of wastes the conceit. And ultimately I felt that the film did kind of waste the conceit. um, Tonally, it goes for that sort of deadpan comedy that's reminiscent, I suppose, of people like Aki Kaurismäki and Roy Andersson, who we spoke about before. But of course, the person it reminds me of most powerfully is Yorgos Lanthimos. There's just
Mm.
no getting away from the fact that this feels almost like an impression of a Lanthimos film, and that's a problem for the film because it feels like it's doing that in an almost desperate kind of way. There's moments of absurdist comedy that does feel almost desperate, with this little bicycle that's a bit funny, but really it's kind of reaching, and then the fancy dress and the paramedic says, does anyone know Batman? Yeah, it is kind of funny, but it's also sort of, hey, you see how deadpan and strange this is. And also the whole setup really is pure Lantimos. You introduce a very weird, disturbing phenomena that everyone responds to in a perfectly matter-of-fact way, as though this phenomena is not distressing or alarming. It's just sort of, they just kind of deal with it. That's a very Lantimos setup. And so it's a shame, as I say, that it reminded me so potently of Lantimos, because it's not as good as him at his best. It's not as good a film as Lobster or Killing of a Sacred Deer, which is a fantastic film. And so what it reminded, the problem with the jokes I found, and the reason they didn't really land for me, is because I realized about half an hour in, we don't know any of his backstory. And so because of that, there's no sense of loss for that first half of the film, because we know nothing about him. So the jokes have no pathos. And it reminded me of the early scenes from Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where we're in Jim Carrey's characters now, before we find out about the relationship that he's forgotten. And when we do find out about the relationship that he's forgotten, his now becomes really poignant, almost painful, because we know what he's lost. And this film felt like 2/3 of it is set in that kind of now before we know what he's lost. So there's no poignancy. And so the only thing it's got going for it is this deadpan humor, which for me didn't quite land. And it turns out that it has to withhold his backstory in order for the ultimate twist to work, which is, of course, that he's not lost his memory. He just wishes he had, because his wife had died. Now, that's a really poignant and sad fact. But the film kind of sets up its own conundrum, because the only way for this twist to work is if they hold off on the backstory. But by holding off on the backstory, 2/3 of the film felt kind of shallow and superficial and didn't work for me. Now, I sympathize with this issue, because this is a structural storytelling issue that, most artists have had to grapple with at one time or another. And it's a shame it doesn't work, because, as I say, that twist is a good one. But for me, it didn't work. I found there's one funny joke where, and I don't even know if it was a joke, but he goes to get a hot dog and he says, can I have some of that yellow sauce on it? Because he can't remember what mustard is. So that made me laugh. But for the most part, I found it occasionally quite boring. Actually, it's by no means a bad film. There's lots to like about it, but it didn't work for me.
Yeah, well, actually, for this week, we're in almost complete agreement. I watched the trailer for this film because, we have a rule, don't we, that we don't find out anything about the film beforehand, apart from, I think we're allowed to read the movie description. So I knew it was kind of presented as part of I think it describes it, the Greek weird wave. So, automatically, even before I'd seen anything, I thought of Lanthimos. But I thought the trailer actually, and we're allowed to watch the trailer. That's what I assume. So I did watch the trailer for this, and I really liked the look of it because I agree, this is a really interesting idea. The basic setup of this film is fascinating, and I thought the trailer does a really good job of showing what potentially a great film this could have been. But I was a bit disappointed with it. I did. So I was thinking of Lanthimos before I'd even watched it. I don't know Greek cinema very well. There probably are other filmmakers, but I was thinking of the Lanthimos films I've seen. I've not seen Lobster yet. I must catch up on that. But I was thinking about Alps and Dogtooth and Killing of a Sacred Deer, and then The Favourite. And they were the four I could remember that I'd seen. And that's the order in which I saw them. And I think that's the order in which they were made. And there's a clear kind of progression, although it doesn't feel like he's doing the same thing every time. It feels like each film has an originality to it. And I know you haven't seen Alps, but in some ways, this film had a simplicity to it that I think Alps had. So it kind of reminded me of the simplicity of Alps, where Alps is, this film about this agency where people can rent kind of actors, but they're really unprofessional and amateur, to play people that they've lost. So to play dead people, and the people that they rent, that they hire, don't look anything like the people. It's kind of absurd, and it's interesting. It's a simple idea like this one that repeats through the film. So you've got several stories of people who've lost someone, renting someone from this agency, and it reminded me of the simplicity of that. But it just didn't feel like it kind of had the substance of Alps. Somehow Alps seemed like it had much more oomph to it, much more heft. And I did think this was a really interesting idea, as you say, and really interesting topics which were addressed in the film, as to how we know who we are, and the fact that in this film, the only way you could know who you are was through family, the importance of family and understanding who we are. And what living is like without an identity, and I thought that was quite interesting. And the contrast between the kind of absurd tasks that they were given, which were kind of a synthetic version of living, versus the really simple things in the film, like how much he liked apples, and the arrangement of the furniture. So while we thought that he really had lost his memory, I thought that there was something quite a little bit of substance there, in the sense of, he actually enjoyed making the flat look like it was his place, moving the bed around. And, he clearly really enjoyed apples. And I thought that was telling us something about, that it's the simple things in life that actually that actually define who we are, and that actually make life meaningful. But I found the humor kind of undermined the seriousness of this topic. And I agree with you that I knew when it was being humorous, but I wasn't really laughing very, very much at all. I actually found it became quite repetitive. You know, it's like the tasks, it really felt like the tasks were not taking me anywhere new. Each task was just, you know, it's like he came up with, you know, what would be half a dozen kind of funny tasks, you know, and the crash one was the one that felt most Lanthimos to me. I really thought that's a Lanthimos moment, the one that where they had to crash the car, and the fact that he was a couple of days behind her. But you know, it just didn't have the cutting edge of a Lanthimos film. It was a waste. I agree with you. And I actually was thrown a bit by the suggestion at the end that he actually, well, it's more than a suggestion, it's clear, isn't it, that he actually hadn't lost his memory. And that this is a film about him dealing with grief and just, you know, pretending he's got the illness in order to just avoid life. And I kind of found that really just undermined the film. It didn't feel like that. To me, that didn't feel like an interesting twist. I was already feeling that the film wasn't as good as a Lanthimos, which is really sad, isn't it? It's really sad that you end up comparing it so much to another filmmaker. And I didn't feel there was anything. It didn't give me anything in the twist. I mean, unlike you, I don't think I was bored in the film. I did find it a little bit repetitive, but you know, I thought it was well made and reasonably engaging. You know, I thought the acting was okay, and you know, but for me, it just lacked substance. It was a good idea, but executed in a way that just fell a little bit short for me. And yeah, I'm not sure that I would really recommend this film. I think you're better off going and watching Lanthimos.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost like there is what I thought there's kind of a formal issue here, and that's that the setup and the story. It would be a great short story. That's what this film should be, is a short story, because written over 8 or 10 pages, it could be brilliant. It's not a feature film, and I think that's the problem. And you know, although our reasoning was different, we were both kind of thrown by this twist, and it seemed to undermine the rest of the film. And that's a real shame, because you know, that should have been quite potent, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to consider, isn't it, whether in terms of the narrative, whether there would have been a way of giving us something of the ambiguity around where, you know, something about the backstory to make the film more ambiguous from the start. Yeah. I just wonder if that, you know, potentially would make the film quite different if we know that he's, you know, there's a bit of uncertainty about him.
There is a bit of uncertainty, because there's a moment where he recognizes the neighbor's dog and then pretends he hasn't. And that's reasonably, but you're right, it would be interesting. In my head, I started imagining ways you could have unpacked this film slightly differently in order for the jokes to have a bit more pathos and still deliver that twist. And, you know, I'm sure there's a way of doing it, but.
Yeah. I mean, I did think it did give us, because the dog recognizing him was a good halfway in the film. I mean, I took that as an example, and then when he avoids the guy that he sees, that he recognizes, that was the first indicator to me that, oh, this is the twist. So, you know, we were starting to have the twist there. But actually, I did wonder at the time when they get him in the ambulance and they ask him if he's got any ID, and he doesn't have any, I did think that's a bit strange.
Yeah, given what's going on, right?
And maybe that is giving something away, that he must have because we see him in his flat, and he must have deliberately left the flat without ID.
And he does start the film knocking his head against the wall, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Like there's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was what I think what let me down the most is that it seems to waste this big idea. You know, it seemed it was almost like you start with because it just implies so much, you know, how would that affect society? And you employ this really big grand idea all for the sake of this one tiny little story that isn't really that engaging, you know.
Yeah.
It's a shame.
Yeah, agreed. So we both agree on that. Bit of a waste.
Yeah. So next one is Black Bear by Lawrence Michael Levine.
Great. Looking forward to it.